Welcome to the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show. Presented by the Michigan Nursery and Landscape Association. Now here's your Garden Show host, Dr. Bob Schutzki.
Hello everyone. Tune in every Saturday at 4 p.m. through August. We will share garden insights, feature guests from Michigan's green industry, and answer your questions submitted through PlantMichiganGreen.com Ask the Expert. Our hope is to make the most of your outdoor living experience. During the week, you can log on to PlantMichiganGreen.com, your landscape and horticulture resource, to pose gardening questions, find a professional horticulturist, locate a retail garden center in your area, or become aware of the rewarding careers in Michigan's green industry. We will spend today's show with Dr. Deb McCullough, forest entomologist with Michigan State University. Dr. Deb is on the forefront with insect pests that plague our forests and landscapes. She will be with us after a short break. So stick around and get into the gardening groove on the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show on News Talk 760 WJR. Welcome back. We're pleased to have Dr. Deb McCullough, forest entomologist with Michigan State University, with us. She will talk about the unwelcome visitors from the insect world. Hi, Deb. How are you?
Good morning, Bob. I'm doing well, thank you.
Great. Thanks for joining us on the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show. And so what can you tell us about the insect world and what it's doing to us?
Well, it's a great summer to be a forest entomologist. I'll tell you that. There doesn't seem to be any shortage of major forest insect pests going on around the state, and most of the worst offenders are invasive pests, species that are not native to Michigan. So
Right.
We're dealing with all kinds of things like emerald ash borer and gypsy moth and so forth.
Yeah. One of the things that I often get questions on about is back to emerald ash borer. And so, for example, it's been here, it's done its damage. Is it still around?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. And the short answer is yes, it's certainly still around. And for those of you that maybe have a fuzzy memory, or maybe you're too young to even remember this, emerald ash borer is native to China and a couple other parts of Asia, and it was first discovered in North America in 2002 in southeast Michigan, the greater Detroit area. That's where it first became established. And so we have literally the longest history of anywhere in the world in terms of being invaded by emerald ash borer. And it's been almost, 20 years now. June of 2002 is when we first found it. And if you live in southeast Michigan, you may remember those years. So many ash trees were killed. Ash trees were dying and declining and falling, and we didn't know anything about the insect. We had to do all kinds of research. And in the past 18 or 19 years now, boy, have we learned a lot about emerald ash borer. And if you haven't been keeping track of this pest, it is now the most costly and most destructive forest insect to ever invade North America. There are infestations in 35 states that we know about and 5 Canadian provinces. It was introduced into Moscow, Russia, and has been spreading west out of Russia, and now most of Europe is very concerned about it. I know Denmark, for example, was going to set up some traps for the first time this summer because there's European ash species that are likely to be vulnerable to this insect as well. And so as far as Michigan goes, we're ground zero. So a lot of areas look to us to see what is happening now that the big decline in mortality of all the ash species has happened. And what we're seeing is that ash borer is certainly still present. And if you know what ash trees look like and you drive along the highways, 96, 127, 75, what you will see is a lot of young ash regenerating. So there's small ash trees that are coming up in the forest, along roadways, and so forth. And ash borer is still around. We can trap it. We can find it. It's colonizing some of these young trees, not necessarily killing them at the same rate, though. And a lot has to do with the fact that in many areas, all or nearly all of the big ash trees are gone now. and it's the carrying capacity of the environment. So if you have a lot of big ash trees, you can produce a lot of emerald ash borer beetles that can attack another ash tree and kill it. On the other hand, if there's only a few emerald ash borer beetles and they lay a few eggs, it appears that some of the ash species we have can actually coexist with emerald ash borer, at least so far. White ash is a really popular tree in landscapes, and it's also very common in forest areas, usually upland areas. Sometimes it mixes in with sugar maple and basswood and that kind of habitat. And there are places where every white ash tree was killed, but there are also places, including southeast Michigan, where more than half of the white ash trees were attacked but managed to survive. And there's still some larvae that get after them, and there's still some trees declining that will probably die, but others, it seems like they can survive with a few larvae feeding on them. Green ash took a harder hit. Most of the green ash trees that were more than 5 or 6 inches in diameter were killed some years ago, in fact. But we have a lot of this young green ash regeneration. And we think that because the carrying capacity is so low, and because we have native and introduced natural enemies now that are attacking emerald ash borer eggs and attacking the emerald ash borer larvae, it's possible that some of these trees will persist over time, and maybe we'll have some larger green ash in some areas. It's going to be real interesting to see how this plays out over the next 20 years.
I
Um,
have I have a woodlot, or I guess a partial forest on my property, and I have several green ash that I see the exit holes, so they were infested, but they're still doing okay. And then I have others that are completely dead. So it's interesting. There's that mix of how heavy they infested and killed the trees.
Yeah, that's really typical of what we're seeing. And ash trees are remarkably resilient. If they are not killed and they have some foliage and they make a little bit of energy, they're really good at putting callus tissue and a new layer of wood over an old injury. And so if as long as they're not completely girdled, it seems like they can make a recovery if the ash borer population doesn't stay really high. I will point out blue ash, it's Fraxinus quadrangulata, and it's not common, but if you're in southeast Michigan, Ann Arbor, any area down there, it's not uncommon. It's a really nice tree, a little bit different because it grows more slowly, but it's as resistant to emerald ash borer as the Asian ash species that we've tested, that have co-evolved with emerald ash borer. And so about, I would say 60 to 70% of the blue ash trees, as long as they're on a pretty good site and they're relatively healthy, they've been attacked, but they're doing well. In fact, some of them look really good. And then at the other end of the spectrum is black ash, which is a northern species. You only typically find it in bogs or along swampy areas. And last year we looked at 30 different forested areas, and every single black ash tree that we were able to find that was more than 4 inches in diameter is dead. And we do have some regeneration in some of these areas, which is, kind of gives you a little bit of hope that black ash might persist. But this same kind of phenomenon is being seen as ash borer continues to spread. And so places like Wisconsin, New York, where ash borer is a little bit more recent, they're starting to see their black ash really fail and decline.
So what's your prognosis for the future? What can we do, if anything, to either ward off this or help minimize the damage?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. If you see that ash borer has colonized those trees, a lot of times you see woodpecker holes up on the trunk. We have really effective systemic insecticides now that can be applied. Typically, you want a professional to apply them. There are some products that a homeowner can use, and and we just know so much more. You can protect the ash tree indefinitely. As far as that goes, white ash and green ash, we're just watching them. There's a lot of biological control efforts that have gone on. I think they're helping, and I just think that white ash in particular has some resistance to emerald ash borer and might persist, even in the forest. Black ash, I'm afraid that honestly, I think we're looking at an ecological catastrophe. Ecologically, it's a really important species. Oftentimes, it's the only tree that occurs in these big swamp, slow-moving water riparian areas. Really important culturally to many Native American and First Nation tribes in the eastern U.S. and Canada. I think we're going to lose it. I think there's a really good chance it might actually be extirpated, even just within the next couple decades. So that one is really kind of tragic.
Short break right now. And so stay tuned for more with Dr. Deb McCullough and the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show on News Talk 760 WJR.
Welcome back to more of the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show with your host, Dr. Bob Schutzki.
Welcome back. We're here with Dr. Deb McCullough, forest entomologist with Michigan State University, and have been talking about insect pests that are impacting our trees. So we've gone through emerald ash borer, Deb. What about gypsy moth?
This is a big year for gypsy moth. All over lower Michigan, we've had big outbreaks in several regions last year and even the year before. The northeastern part of lower Michigan, a little bit in the northwest, a little bit in the north central. But this year, southeast Michigan, southwest Michigan, Jackson County, much of the northeast and northwest, everybody seems to be having a gypsy moth outbreak this year. And I know anybody that's living through it will realize just how unpleasant that can be. Lots and lots of big hairy caterpillars feeding on leaves and dropping frass. That's the nice entomology term for their little fecal materials that fall out of the trees. It's just not very pleasant at all.
Deb, could you describe the coloration on the gypsy moth caterpillars?
Sure. There's a lot of caterpillars that are out and about right now, of course. It's June, a lot of insects are doing their feeding and developing now, but there's only one gypsy moth. And the caterpillars have red spots and blue spots on their backs. They have a yellowish head with some black markings on it, and they have some hairs that come off mostly the sides of their bodies. They don't make tents or, silk up the tree. That's a different insect, not nearly as big of a deal as gypsy moth is.
Great. Quite often people confuse tent caterpillars with gypsy moths when they see them because of the colorations.
Yeah, they do. And we certainly have tent caterpillar. We have two species that are native. Eastern tent caterpillar, you'll get the silk tents in crabapple and black cherry trees. And forest tent caterpillar tends to be more in northern Michigan, northern lower and upper Michigan. And it really likes to feed on aspen, but it will feed on sugar maple and sometimes on oaks as well. And we have some forest tent caterpillar going this year, but nothing like the gypsy moth outbreaks that we're seeing in lower Michigan.
Deb, I grew up in New Jersey, and when we had gypsy moth infestations, everybody relied on the government to aerial spray the forest. Can you tell us a little bit about that in Michigan?
There was a time when some of that went on in Michigan. Back in the 90s, Michigan went through the first big gypsy moth outbreaks. Gypsy moth is not native here. We've had it for at least since the early 1980s, but the first big outbreaks occurred from about 1991 through 96 or 98. And at that time, there was a cost share suppression program where the USDA Forest Service paid for part of the program. It was administered through the Michigan Department of Agriculture at that time, and then a county, usually it was a county, sometimes townships, would assess some sort of a millage or collect money and pay for the rest of the program. And that has gone away some years ago, several years ago. In fact, there really isn't a cost share suppression program. And there was a lot of concern about using tax dollars, both federal, state, and even local tax dollars to spray trees on private property. And so I don't really see that program coming back. There are still municipalities and in a few cases counties that have their own BT spray programs. BT is a bacteria. It's naturally occurring. and it only affects caterpillars and only if they feed on the leaves that are sprayed. It doesn't persist very long, so it's really critical to get the timing right. And typically BT is applied in May, somewhere between mid and late May for most of the area. But there isn't any government assistance for that anymore. That's something that a neighborhood association, a lake association, or like I said, in a few cases, some more governmental jurisdiction, I guess we could say, would organize and administer.
What can a homeowner do if they have a heavy infestation of gypsy moth caterpillars?
Well, I can tell you what people are doing, and that's a lot of swearing and cussing and stomping on caterpillars.
Yeah, right.
There's different options. First off, gypsy moth outbreaks don't last forever. The caterpillars have about, I'd say, 2, maybe 3 weeks of feeding left, and then they will be finished for the summer. They will spin a cocoon. They go through a pupation process inside the cocoon. The moths will be out in July, fluttering around. They don't feed or cause any damage. The females will lay an egg mass, and that's it, up until next spring, sometime in May when those eggs start to hatch. So one option at this point is just to tough it out. I know it's not pleasant, but we don't have much longer to deal with it. There are a couple of diseases that are important in causing outbreaks to collapse, and so those diseases typically don't start to really kick in and affect the population until usually it's about the 3rd year of the outbreak, and then the 3rd year, the 4th year, there'll be a big die-off of caterpillars. If that's a little bit too long to wait, there are some things people can do right now. You can hire a professional and have trees treated with an insecticide. It's too late to use BT. The caterpillars are just too big at this point. But if there is an arborist who has the equipment to get spray up into the canopies of the trees where the insects are feeding, that can be an option. There's issues with that. There's drift problems. You're not using BT at this point. You're using a conventional insecticide. So there will be non-targets that will likely be affected, other kinds of insects and so forth. You can inject trees. There's insecticides that have imamectin benzoate in them, and they're injected into the base of the tree by a professional arborist. And the insecticide actually moves up the tree and out into the leaves, and that will be effective. It takes, perhaps 4, 5, 7 days to be effective, but that is something that can work. You can use barrier bands, hiding bands, we call them, where you wrap about a 14 or 20 inch wide flap of burlap around the tree and let the caterpillars congregate there in the morning. They'll hide out all day, and you have to come around and knock the caterpillars into a bucket of soapy water, and that'll kill them, but you have to do it every day. And so it's not really something that's going to be practical for more than, 1 or 2 trees right around the house. Some people like sticky bands. You can buy stuff online that's sticky material. You have to wrap plastic around the trunk of the tree and then smear maybe 15 or 16 inches worth of a band of sticky material to try to trap the caterpillars as they go up and down the tree. It's somewhat effective. It's kind of like barrier bands. Might be something that works on a couple of trees. Doesn't work great. It makes you feel good, though, because you'll see lots of dead caterpillars stuck in the goop. The other thing is that the foliated trees are going to recover. Any kind of hardwood tree, the oaks, the aspens, crabapple, and so forth, they may look terrible by the end of June. They may have lost most of their leaves. And what will happen is a tree that loses 60 or 65% of its leaves will produce another set of buds, and you'll have a second set of leaves coming out on that tree probably by late July.
That's always promising. When I was a kid, we would have to go around and look for the fuzzy egg masses and scrape those off the trees and bumpers and pallets and everything else that the moths tended to lay their eggs on.
Yeah, and that's still a really good recommendation for people that are living in an area that's having an outbreak. The females will lay those egg masses. Each female lays one egg mass, and if it's a small, not very healthy female, she'll put about 200 eggs into the egg mass, and it'll be maybe the size of a nickel or a quarter. And if it's a big, healthy, robust female, the egg mass will be 2 to 3 inches long. It'll have multiple layers of eggs, and you can get 1,000 or 1,200 eggs in one egg mass. And so we usually have people start doing that in the fall. And you can scrape those egg masses off and soak them in a bucket of soapy water, leave them there for a day or two, and that'll kill the eggs. I know that you can take egg masses and toss them into a fire pit, and not only do you get the satisfaction of controlling those eggs, killing off those eggs, but you can listen to them snap, crackle, and pop, kind of like little Rice Krispies in the fire.
Okay, thanks, Deb, for all that information on gypsy moth. So stay tuned for more information from Dr. Deb McCullough and the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show on News Talk 760 WJR. Welcome back. We're here with Dr. Deb McCullough, forest entomologist with Michigan State University, and we have been talking about insect pests. So we've gone through emerald ash borer, gypsy moth. So can you tell us a little bit about beech bark disease and the beech bark scale?
Sure. That's another kind of a sad story. Beech bark disease is what we call a complex that involves two different organisms. Both of them are invasive, not native to North America. And one is a very tiny little scale insect. For most of its lifespan, it doesn't have any legs or anything very distinctive about it. It's like a little pink ball that sucks sap out of the inner bark of beech trees. And as it feeds, it secretes white wax around itself. And if you see a beech tree that has white woolly wax up and down the trunk, that's beech scale. And beech scale doesn't actually vector the fungus pathogen. It pokes little holes into the outer bark to get at the good nutrients in the inner bark. And every one of those little holes provides an entry point for the fungus that actually causes the real damage to the tree. And it's a neonectria fungus. It's related to some of our native fungi. But what happens is it gets under the bark and it kills little patches of the inner bark. And when those dead patches of inner bark coalesce, they effectively girdle the branch. So the tree can't move any nutrients from the leaves down the branch, down the trunk, into the roots. And you'll see the canopy of trees start to turn yellow, branches will die, and eventually the whole tree can die. And we found beech bark disease back in 2000. It got started in Lower Michigan. We found it first at Ludington State Park. And just a few weeks later, we found it north of Newberry in the UP at Bass Lake Campground. And it has spread since then, and especially in the UP, the impacts have been pretty profound. As of 2014, in the eastern half of the UP, about 50% of the large beech trees, 10 inches in diameter or larger, had already been killed. My guess is that more of those trees are dead now. And in Lower Michigan, we're starting to see tree mortality from beech bark disease as well, particularly up in the northwest area. Sleeping Bear Dunes, for example, is starting to really get hammered by beech bark disease. And it's really unfortunate. There's not a lot that can be done about it. It's been in North America. It came into Halifax, Nova Scotia in 1890 on nursery stock that came in from Europe. And then it turned out that the Europeans think the scale insect is probably native to Asia. Whatever, it's just really doing a number on American beech trees. And
do we know if it impacts European beech?
Not as severely as American beech. American beech is just more vulnerable, and especially large trees tend to be attacked by the scale. The scales just have an easier time attaching themselves to large trees. Then the fungus gets in, and so the biggest and gnarliest and coolest looking beech trees tend to be the ones that die first. And of course, that has really sad implications for wildlife resources, because beech nuts, every little animal in the forest likes to eat beech nuts, and a tree has to be mature before it will start producing beech nuts. And so we're losing that hard mast, and beech trees tend to have a lot of cavities where pine martens and birds like to nest, and it's just, it's really unfortunate.
if a person has a beech bark scale on their property, is there anything they can do or should they do to control it or eliminate it?
There's not a lot of options. We've tried insecticides, we've tried scraping things, we've, injecting insecticides into the tree. I will say, and this is going to sound a little bit goofy, but it kind of works. If you can keep the scale insects off the tree, you reduce the chance that the tree is going to get this very aggressive non-native fungus pathogen. And so we've used a push broom and a bucket of soapy water and basically just brushed the scale insects off. You'll see them coming off. The white wax kind of, you just keep brushing until you get it off. Up in Nova Scotia, they have kept a tree alive for over 100 years simply by going in with a cherry picker and brooms and brushes and cleaning the tree off, cleaning the scale off the tree. So it's possible.
I wonder if you could use a power washer and blow them off.
You could. There's people that are doing that actually up in the Northwest, and that works. You don't want to blow the bark off the tree. That's not a good thing. And we have found that if you spray the adelgids with an insecticide that has dinotephuron in it, you will kill the insects. We think that you can spray the insects with a soapy compound. I know we tried Pintra bark, it's basically just a detergent, and it kind of goes right through the wax and affects the membranes of the insects, and that seems to be effective. But you got to spray, you pretty much have to spray all the insects up in the high branches and so forth for that to really protect your trees. And it's not an easy thing to do unless you have a cherry picker handy.
Yeah. Well, because you talked about an adelgid, can that lead us into hemlock woolly adelgid?
Sure. Yeah, we're just going from one sad situation to another.
Right.
I don't know why we're laughing about it. It's kind of black humor.
Exactly. It's almost a cry.
Yeah, exactly. Well, hemlock adelgid is another invasive pest. It's native to Asia, Japan in particular. And it has been in the eastern U.S. since 1951. They found it in Virginia, and it is also a tree killer. And there's no pathogen involved in this one. It's just the insects. And it's an insect, it's kind of like an aphid, and it will attach itself right at the base of the needles, and it has this very long stylet, kind of like a long straw, and it sticks that stylet through the woody part of the shoot, and it sucks nutrients that would otherwise be going out to the needles. And they don't kill trees as fast as emerald ash borer will kill trees, but within anywhere from 4 to 10 years of becoming infested, you start to see trees really decline and really die. And we know we have hemlock woolly adelgid now in 5 counties, all in West Michigan, and the infestations of the insect are real close to Lake Michigan. We think it's the lake effect weather. A little bit warmer temperatures in the winter, doesn't get as extremely cold. Sometimes the snow helps to ameliorate the cold temperatures. But it's really going to devastate hemlock unless we are successful in containing it and suppressing those populations.
I know the hemlocks that are coming through the nursery industry are well inspected for this, and the USDA and Michigan Department of Agriculture are all very active in making sure we don't introduce it into other parts of the state.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because as bad as it is to have these localized kind of discrete infestations near Lake Michigan, most of the hemlock forest in the state has not been affected yet. We have over 170 million hemlock trees that grow primarily in northern lower Michigan and the upper peninsula. And the goal is to keep hemlock woolly adelgid from getting into that area. Because again, hemlock, it's not a great timber species. It's kind of like beech, but boy, the ecological roles that it plays and the implications for wildlife, if we lose hemlock, are going to be pretty profound.
One of the things when we talk about all these different insects and are the symptoms or the signs. Can you give us a recommendation on where we could go to look to verify if in fact we do have this, because a lot of times things are either misdiagnosed or there's other things that look similar to it but are not the specific problem.
Sure, that's a really good point, Bob, because it took all of us a little while to learn how to recognize these insects. Google Images is great, but be sure that you're looking at a website that you can trust. The Michigan Department of Agriculture, DNR, and in some cases with MSU's cooperation, has an invasive species website. And you can click on various links and see photographs of hemlock woolly adelgid, beech bark disease, and the beech scale, certainly emerald ash borer, and some of the others. I would say if you get in on the internet and you look at information that's been posted by universities or by state agencies, you should have confidence in that. And there's some really fine photographs and images that are online now where people can look to see what they've got. Be careful of some of the amateur naturalists and even some of the commercial arborists or nurseries. Sometimes they misidentify the organism that's in their pictures, and that can be a problem. But universities and state agencies, federal agencies, and so forth, they will put up reliable information.
One of the other thing, I'd just like to add caution on that. What we've observed in the past is sometimes people look at internet sites from far away from our geographical area, and some of the descriptions that you may find from the Northeast or the Southeast, something like that, may not necessarily be true for us in Michigan. So always make sure that you verify that what you're looking at will apply to you and your climate conditions and in your geographical area.
That's a really good point. And I might also add that there is the MSU Plant Diagnostic Clinic, and they have an entomologist, a plant pathologist, a weed scientist, and a nematologist on staff. And if you have a tree that looks like there's something wrong with it and you think you are seeing an insect problem or even a disease problem, often you can take a couple of photos of the problem, email them into the diagnostic clinic, and they may be able to look at what you send them and make a diagnosis for you. And if it gets more complicated than that, they will reach out via email and ask you to send samples or something similar that they can actually look at in person.
Yeah, that's good information. You know what? We have to take a short break, so stay with us, Deb, and stay tuned for more information from Dr. Deb McCullough and the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show on News Talk 760 WJR.
Now back to more gardening with your host, Dr. Bob Schutzki, on the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show. Here's Dr. Bob.
Welcome back. We're here with Dr. Deb McCullough, forest entomologist with Michigan State University, and she's been giving us a wealth of information on insects, pests that are impacting our trees. We have two more insects that we'd like you to mention today, Deb, and next is spotted lanternfly.
Well, that one is not yet in Michigan, I'm happy to say. That's another insect that's native to Asia. It is in Pennsylvania, and a number of other states are finding populations to the east there, New York, and some in New England and so forth. We're on the alert for it. It's been found in one county in Ohio. It's an insect that feeds on a wide variety of trees. It really likes tree of heaven, which a lot of people consider to be an invasive tree species. Most people don't particularly care for that. But it will also feed on the woody portions of grapevines, hop vines, apple trees, most kinds of fruit trees. And as if that wasn't enough, when the insect feeds, it's sucking lots and lots of sap, and it will excrete lots and lots of honeydew, which is sticky, sugary, processed plant sap. And then black sooty mold grows on that honeydew, and it can just be very unpleasant if you're living in an area where there's lots and lots of spotted lanternflies. So we hope it will be some number of years before it arrives in Michigan, but boy, we're sure keeping an eye out for it.
Yeah, it's almost like when these things start, they eventually work their way further west. But But hopefully we can be concerned about that. And the last one that we'd like you to talk about is cicadas. We heard that this is the 17 year, and the explosion is supposed to occur.
Yeah, well, see, that's good. We're ending on a light, happy note because you got to admire an insect that's been 17 years in the ground, just waiting for the right time, and it will come out. And those adult cicadas are pretty cool. They make that crazy kind of noise. If you're ever in an area where the 17-year cicadas have emerged, it's almost deafening. They're not going to hurt a mature tree. You know, they don't really feed on the trees to speak of. All they want to do is mate. And then the female will lay eggs, and she actually embeds the eggs in the twigs of live trees. And sometimes that's a little bit of an issue for small trees, say in a nursery setting. But for most of us, it's just an amazing phenomenon. And everybody should see it once. And then after you've experienced it once, you might not need to do that again.
Right. When I was a kid in New Jersey, and we had an infestation, and we would go around with Hellman's mayonnaise jars and fill them up with cicadas, and they would hum and sing and do all the other things. But again,
they're pretty cool insects. You know, it's the males that make that noise. They have a little mechanism on the side of their body. It's like pushing the lid of a tin can down, and then they release it, and it pops back up, and that's that sound that you hear. And you do that a whole bunch of times really quickly, and you can sound just like a cicada.
Great, great. Hey, Deb, we really appreciate the time you spent with us today. You gave us a real lot of useful information, things to be aware of and concerned about. And again, thanks for spending the time on the PlantMichiganGreen.com gardening show.
Well, thanks for the invitation, Bob, and best of luck to you and all the other folks out there working in the nurseries and gardens and landscapes.
Great. Thanks a lot, Deb. We'll see you.
Bye-bye.
Well, don't forget to visit our website, PlantMichiganGreen.com, and click on Ask the Expert to submit your landscape and gardening questions. You may hear your question and answer on the air. And if you have any questions about the insects that you heard about today, please go on the website and register your questions, and we'll get the answers for you from Deb or the other entomologists at MSU. And remember to tune in every Saturday at 4 p.m. through August for the best information and advice to maximize your outdoor living experience. And during the week, log on to PlantMichiganGreen.com, your landscaping and horticulture resource, to find a professional, a retail garden center, pose your gardening questions, or explore rewarding careers in the green industry. That's all for this week. I'm Dr. Bob, wishing you sunshine, a little rain, and very little insects. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll talk again next week.
You've been listening to the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show with Dr. Bob Schutzki, presented by the Michigan Nursery and Landscape Association.